She had been sitting on the left side of the aisle for 11 months. Third pew from the back. Close enough to the door that leaving required no one to move for her. No one to notice her going. No one to require an explanation for why she was already in her coat before the final hymn had finished. She arrived late and she left early, and she spoke to no one and she kept her eyes on the front of the church. And she had been doing all of this with such consistency that the congregation of Harlan Falls had long since stopped trying to include her in anything and had accepted her ghostliness as simply the nature of a quiet woman who kept to herself. He had been sitting on the right side of the aisle for just as long. Third pew from the back. The only pew in the church where a man of his dimensions could sit without his knees pressing into the wood in front of him. He had been there every Sunday. He had noticed her every Sunday. He had said nothing, because she had made it clear. In the architecture of every Sunday morning she had constructed with such careful invisibility, that saying nothing was the most respectful thing available to him. 11 months of sitting across the aisle from someone and never learning their name. 11 months of the same distance, the same careful silence, the same Sunday morning choreography of two people who had each decided, for their own reasons, that the space between them was where things needed to stay. And it had stayed there. Every Sunday, without exception, for 11 months. And then the snow came. The bad kind. The kind that kept most of the congregation home and made the road into town something that only the determined or the desperate attempted. The kind that left the church half empty and cold and with only one pew, with enough space for a slim woman who arrived late and wanted to be invisible. The pew on the right side of the aisle. Third from the back, where he was already sitting with his hat in his enormous hands and his gray eyes on the front of the church and the specific quality of stillness that had been present on the right side of her peripheral vision every single Sunday for 11 months. She stood in the aisle for a moment. He did not look at her immediately. When he did, he moved to the far end of the pew without being asked, without making it an occasion, without anything that would have required her to acknowledge that the proximity was anything other than a practical arrangement produced by a snowstorm. She sat. The service began, and for the first time in 11 months, the distance between them was the width of a church pew rather than the width of an aisle. It was a small distance. It changed everything. Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this story already has you, leave us a word below. There is a particular kind of grief that does not look like grief from the outside. It does not present itself in the ways that communities recognize and respond to, does not arrive with the visible markers of devastation that invite the casseroles and the condolences and the sustained neighborly concern that genuine communal warmth produces in small towns when one of their own has lost something significant. It presents itself, instead, as composure, as quietness, as the specific self-contained quality of someone who has decided, for reasons that the community cannot see and has not been invited to understand, that the interior of their loss is not something they are prepared to share with anyone in the available vicinity. Nora Vale had that kind of grief, and she had been carrying it since the previous January, and she had been carrying it with such thoroughness and such consistency that the town of Harlan Falls, Colorado had largely concluded that she was simply a quiet woman who kept to herself rather than a woman who was drowning in something she had no remaining vocabulary for. She had not always been quiet. That was the part of herself she sometimes thought about in the early mornings, before the day required anything from her. The specific memory of who she had been before the series of events that had produced the current version of herself, the version that arrived late to church and left early, and spoke to no one and moved through the town of Harlan Falls, like something trying to go unnoticed by the world it was moving through. She had been before all of it a woman who talked too much at dinner tables, and who had opinions about books that she expressed without being asked, and who laughed at things that were only marginally funny because she had always found the world funnier than most people seemed to, and who had been told by more than one person who meant it as a compliment that she was impossible not to notice when she walked into a room. She had been born in Ohio, the youngest of 4 children in a family that was warm and chaotic and entirely committed to the specific brand of domestic happiness that came from a household where everyone talked at once and the meals ran long and the evenings on the porch in summer were the organizing center of the family's collective life. Her father had been a school teacher, bookish and gentle, and possessed of the specific humor of an educated man who had never taken himself too seriously. And her mother had been the kind of woman who was the organizing intelligence of everything around her without appearing to be organizing anything, who had run the household and the family's social life and her husband's professional concerns with the specific, seamless competence of someone for whom competence was simply the natural expression of caring about what she was doing. Nora had inherited from both of them in roughly equal measure, which produced in her the specific combination of genuine intellectual curiosity and practical warmth that had made her, in the Ohio town where she grew up, the kind of person that other people gravitated toward without always being able to articulate why. She had met Robert Vale when she was 23, at a social occasion in the county seat, a gathering of the kind that frontier communities produced to maintain their social coherence across the distances that separated them. He had been 28, a man who had come west from Pennsylvania 2 years earlier to establish himself in the land agent business, and who had the specific confidence of someone who had made a deliberate choice about the life he wanted and was in the process of constructing it with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the outcome was not in doubt. He had been handsome in the specific way that made people look twice and then look again, with the easy manner of someone who had always been the most comfortable person in any room, and who carried that comfort as a natural fact rather than an achievement. He had focused on Nora with the complete attention of a man who had decided something, and she had found the focus, at 23, and accustomed to the admiration of the Ohio town where everyone knew her well enough to take her for granted, genuinely disorienting in the best possible way. They had married within the year. She had gone with him to Colorado, to the town of Harlan Falls, where he had established his land agent office, with the specific hope of a young woman who has made what feels like the right decision and who is moving toward the life that the decision will produce with the complete commitment of someone who does not do things halfway. She had loved Robert Vale. That was the truth she held most carefully and most honestly in the complicated interior of her grief, because the loving of him was real and had been real from the beginning and remained real in a way that the other truths of the marriage did not diminish. She had loved him, and she had built a life around the loving, and the life had been, for the first 2 years, genuinely good in the specific, uncomplicated way of a life that is working the way it is supposed to work. The difficulty had arrived gradually, as the most significant difficulties tended to arrive, through the accumulation of small things, rather than through any single dramatic event that could be pointed to and labeled and made sense of. Robert Vale was a man of considerable charm and considerable ambition, and a specific quality of restlessness that had been, in the early years of the marriage, directed entirely toward the building of the life he had planned, and that had produced, in those early years, the forward momentum that had made the life feel like it was going somewhere. The ambition was real, the charm was real. The restlessness was also real, and it was the restlessness that had, across the 3rd and 4th year of the marriage, begun to express itself in ways that Nora had been slow to recognize, because the recognition required her to revise an understanding of her husband that she had built across 4 years and that she was not initially willing to revise. She did not talk about the specifics of the marriage's difficult years with anyone, not in Ohio, where the family she had left behind would have received the information with the specific combination of love and helplessness that would have made the telling harder rather than easier. Not in Harlan Falls, where she had been Robert Vale's wife for 4 years, and where the community's understanding of her was entirely mediated through its understanding of him, and where revising that understanding would have required a version of disclosure she was not equipped to make. She had managed the difficult years in the specific way she managed everything, which was with the focused, quiet competence of someone who has decided that the management of a situation is what the situation requires, and that the management comes before everything else, including the feeling. Robert had died in January of the previous year, not from anything dramatic, not from the kind of death that produced a clean narrative with a clear villain. A fever quickly progressed, the doctor unable to do more than watch it move through him with a speed that had not allowed for preparation or for the specific domestic arrangements that a slower death permitted. He was gone in 9 days, and Nora had sat in the house they had shared for 4 years on the morning after, and had felt the complicated and entirely unresolvable mixture of things that she had been afraid she would feel and that she felt anyway, which was the grief for the man she had loved and the grief for the life she had hoped for, and the specific guilty, complicated grief for the years that had been hard and that were now never going to resolve into anything, were simply going to remain what they had been, permanently, because the person who had been part of them was gone and the resolving had become impossible. Harlan Falls had responded with the warmth of a community that genuinely meant well. The casseroles had arrived. The condolences had been offered. The women of the church had come with their practical kindnesses and their gentle inquiries, and their invitations to join the various social structures through which the town maintained its communal life. And Nora had received all of it with the composed grace of someone who understood that these offerings were genuine, and that the genuine required acknowledgement. And she had thanked everyone appropriately and had declined the invitations gently and had retreated. As soon as the specific social requirements of the early grief period had been met, into the quiet that had become her primary available mode of being in the world. The quiet had continued. Month after month, it had continued, deepening from the temporary quiet of acute grief into the specific, sustained quiet of someone who had concluded, not consciously but through the accumulated logic of daily experience, that the less visible she made herself, the less likely she was to encounter the specific difficulties that visibility produced. She had stopped being Robert Vale's wife without becoming anything else in the community's understanding of her, and the liminal quality of that position had produced in her a specific social uncertainty that she had managed by reducing her social exposure to the minimum that was compatible with continued residence in a small town where everyone's business was everyone's business, and complete invisibility was not achievable. The church was the one place she had not stopped going. Not from religious conviction, or not only from that, but from the specific practical logic of a woman who understood that complete withdrawal from the community's most central social institution would generate more attention than the continued attendance that she managed with the specific careful choreography of arriving late and leaving early and making herself, within the space, as unremarkable as possible. She sat in the third pew from the back on the left because it was close to the door. She kept her eyes on the front. She spoke to no one. She had been doing this for 11 months, with the thoroughness of someone who had turned invisibility into a practice and the practice into a second nature. She had not, across those 11 months, paid specific attention to the man on the right side of the aisle, or she had told herself she had not, which was its own form of paying attention. The specific attention of someone who is aware of something at the edge of their peripheral vision and is managing the awareness by not turning toward it. She had been aware of him in the way you were aware of the weather, as a condition of the environment rather than as something that required direct engagement. Large, still, present every Sunday without exception on the right side of the aisle, in the third pew from the back. She had not known his name. She had not wanted to know his name because knowing his name would have made him specific rather than peripheral, and specific was not a category she was currently accepting applications for. She had told herself this every Sunday for 11 months. And then the snow had come. And the third pew from the back on the left had been occupied by a family she did not know who had arrived before her and who filled it entirely. And she had stood in the aisle with the snow still on her coat and the church colder than usual around her, and the specific horror of someone whose carefully constructed invisibility has just encountered an obstacle it had not prepared for. And she had looked at the available options, and there had been only one. And it was on the right side of the aisle. And there was a man sitting at one end of it, who was so large that the pew looked as though it had been made for someone considerably smaller than the person currently occupying it. He had looked at her. Not with surprise, not with the particular social brightness of someone who was going to make an occasion of the situation. He had simply looked at her with the gray eyes that were, at close range, considerably more than the peripheral awareness of 11 Sunday mornings had allowed her to see. And he had moved to the far end of the pew with the unhurried deliberateness of someone for whom making space for another person was simply the obvious response to a person needing space. And he had returned his attention to the front of the church as if nothing had happened that required further acknowledgement. She had sat, the service had begun, and the distance between them, which had been the width of an aisle for 11 months, was now the width of a pew. She had not known, sitting down, that the width of a pew was going to be the thing that changed everything. She had found out. There are men who are alone in the way that furniture is alone, present in a space, functional within it, unremarkable in the specific way of things that have been in the same place for long enough that the space has simply organized itself around them and stopped noticing them as anything other than a fixture. And then there are men who are alone in the way that Ford Callahan was alone, which was with the specific quality of someone who has made a thorough peace with their solitude without having made a permanent peace with it, who has learned to live well inside it without having concluded that it was the whole of what was available, who carried the alone the way you carried a coat that fit well enough but that you had not stopped noticing was a coat rather than the warmth itself. He had been that kind of alone for most of his adult life, and he had managed it with the same quality he brought to everything, which was the patient, deliberate competence of someone for whom the management of difficult things was simply the available mode of engagement with a world that had not consistently offered easier alternatives. He had grown up in the Texas Hill Country, the second of 3 sons in a ranching family that had been working the same land for 2 generations, and that had the specific relationship with work and weather, and the honest exchange of effort for result that long tenure on difficult land produced in the people who chose to stay with it. His father had been a man of few words and immense capability, who had communicated his values entirely through the quality of what he did, and who had produced in his sons, through that method, men who understood instinctively that character was demonstrated rather than declared, and that the demonstration required consistency across time rather than performance in individual moments. Ford had absorbed this understanding so completely and so early that it had become simply how he moved through the world, the baseline assumption rather than the considered position, and the world had responded to it with the specific respect that consistent, reliable behavior eventually earned from even the most skeptical of communities. He had been large since adolescence, the kind of large that arrived early and settled permanently, and that required, in a boy becoming a man, the specific adjustment of someone learning to inhabit a body that exceeded the average dimensions of the spaces built for average bodies. He had learned to move carefully, not timidly, not with the self-conscious apology of someone who found their own presence embarrassing, but with the deliberate quietness of someone who had understood through long experience that his size communicated things about him before he had an opportunity to communicate anything himself, and who had decided that the most effective response to that preemptive communication was to let his behavior revise it over time. He had been doing this for 20 years, and he was good at it, had refined the quietness and the deliberateness into something that was no longer a strategy, but simply who he was, and the people who had known him long enough had stopped seeing the size first and started seeing the man, which was what he had always been working toward. He had come to Harlan Falls 3 years ago, not from any single clear reason, but from the accumulation of smaller ones. The Texas operation had been sold after his father's death to settle the estate between the 3 sons, and the specific grief of that loss had been complicated enough by the specific grief of what the selling meant that he had found himself, for the first time in his adult life, without the organizing principle that the land had always provided, and the absence of it had produced in him a restlessness that he had addressed in the characteristic way, through deliberate action rather than prolonged deliberation. Colorado had been recommended by a man he had worked with briefly in New Mexico, who had said the high country ranching was good and the land was still available at prices that a man with modest capital could manage, and Ford had found both things to be accurate, and had bought the Callahan spread and had spent 3 years building it into something that was beginning, in the spring of the 3rd year, to look like what he had intended it to look like, which was a working ranch that could sustain itself and him indefinitely if the seasons were reasonable and the management was sound. He attended the First Methodist Church of Harlan Falls because the church was the organizing social institution of the community, and he understood that belonging to a community required participation in its institutions, and because the Sunday mornings had a specific quality that he had come to value, which was the quality of an hour in which the week's practical requirements were suspended and something else was permitted to be present, something quieter and more interior than the daily work allowed for. He was not a performatively religious man. He was a man for whom the specific gravity of a Sunday morning in a mountain church, with the light coming through the windows at the angle it came through in winter, and the congregation gathered in the specific communal warmth of people who have chosen to be in the same place at the same time for the same reason, had a value that he found difficult to articulate, but that he was not willing to give up simply because the articulation eluded him. He had noticed Nora Vale on her first Sunday. He had been sitting in the 3rd pew from the back on the right, which was where he always sat because it was the only pew where his legs fit without pressing into the wood in front of him. And she had come in late, as she would come in late every Sunday for the following 11 months, and she had sat in the 3rd pew from the back on the left, which was directly across the aisle from him. And he had registered her presence in the way he registered most things, which was completely and without drama, simply noting the fact of her and filing it with the other facts of the environment. He had looked at her once, briefly, in that first week. Not intrusively, not with the particular social brightness of someone who intended to make an occasion of the noticing. He had looked in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, with the complete unhurried attention of a man for whom looking was a form of thinking rather than a form of engagement. And what he had seen in that single brief look had settled in him with the specific weight of something that required more consideration than the available moment permitted. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that was entirely unperformed, the beauty present and entirely incidental to the quality of her attention, which was directed at the front of the church with the focused intensity of someone for whom the looking forward was doing a specific amount of work that had nothing to do with the sermon. She was wearing dark colors, and she was sitting very still, and she had the specific quality of someone who was trying very hard not to be noticed by anyone in the room, which was, he had understood immediately, and with the particular clarity of someone who recognized the attempt because he had observed it in other contexts, itself a form of information about what had produced the trying. He had not looked at her directly again for 11 months. Not because she was not worth looking at, which she obviously was, but because the looking would have been a form of the noticing she was working so hard to avoid, and the most respectful thing available to him was to honor the work by not undoing it. He had been aware of her every Sunday with the peripheral attention of someone who has filed a thing in the important category and checks it occasionally to confirm it is still there and still the same. And across the 11 months he had accumulated a specific understanding of her that was not intimate and was not presumptuous, but that was genuine, built from the specific available information of 50-something Sunday mornings observed, with a patient comprehensive attention that was his characteristic quality. He knew she arrived late and left early, which told him something about her relationship with the community and the specific social anxiety that the arriving and leaving was managing. He knew she sat near the door, which told him something about the specific quality of her need to have an exit available, the specific quality of someone for whom the ability to leave quickly was a precondition of being able to be present at all. He knew she kept her eyes forward with the focused intensity of someone using the looking forward as a form of containment, as a way of managing the interior by organizing the exterior attention. He knew she wore dark colors every Sunday without exception, which was the mourning that had continued past the conventional period, which told him that the grief was either recent or complicated or both. He knew she was alone every Sunday without exception, that no one sat with her and no one greeted her on arrival and no one engaged her on departure, which told him that the community had accepted her invisibility as a fact rather than a condition, which told him that the invisibility had been successful and consistent for long enough to have been absorbed into the community's general understanding of who she was. He had thought about speaking to her, not in the way of someone planning an approach, not with any agenda beyond the simple acknowledgement that 11 months of sitting across an aisle from the same person without acknowledging the consistent proximity of it was a specific kind of social fiction that was sustained only by mutual agreement and that he was not entirely certain was serving either of them well. He had thought about it and had decided each Sunday that the decision to say nothing was the right decision because she had not indicated through any of her Sunday morning behavior that she was open to the speaking, and he was not going to project an openness onto her that she had not communicated, because doing that would have been about his own discomfort with the silence rather than about any genuine service to her. So he had been silent for 11 months. He had sat across the aisle from a woman he had been noticing for 11 months, and he had said nothing and done nothing and had maintained the specific respectful distance that her Sunday morning behavior requested. And he had told himself that this was the right thing, and he had believed it, and it was the right thing. And he had also, in the evenings of the Sundays when he rode back to the Callahan spread in the specific quality of a Colorado winter afternoon, sat with the specific weight of the silence in a way that told him the silence was costing him something, which was information he had filed alongside everything else and had not yet determined what to do with. The snowstorm had been building for 2 days. He had watched it come in from the west with the specific reading of someone who had been watching weather across difficult country for 30 years and who understood what the particular quality of the cloud formation meant for the next 48 hours. He had ridden into town on the Sunday morning anyway, because the church was where he went on Sunday mornings, and because the habit of showing up for the things he committed to was not something he revised based on weather conditions, and because there had been a specific quality to the previous Sunday, the 11th month of the same Sunday, that had produced in him the particular restlessness of someone who has been patient for a long time and is beginning to understand that the patience has reached a natural limit without his having decided what to do about that. He had arrived at the church to find it half empty, which was the predictable result of the storm for people with less specific reasons than his own for making the effort. He had taken his pew, the third from the back on the right, and he had set his hat on his knee, and he had directed his attention to the front of the church with the specific quality of someone settling into the familiar routine of a Sunday morning. And he had been aware, without looking, of the aisle beside him and the pew across it, and the specific absence of the presence that had been there every Sunday for 11 months. He had not let himself look at the left side of the aisle until he heard the door, which was later than she usually arrived. And he had looked then with the unhurried directness that was his characteristic mode when he had decided to look at something, and he had seen her standing in the aisle with the snow still on her coat and the specific expression of someone whose carefully constructed plan has just encountered an obstacle it had not accounted for. Looking at the third pew on the left that was occupied by a family that had arrived before her, and that left no room for her and no viable alternative to the pew on the right. He had moved to the far end without deliberation, without making it an occasion, without any of the social performance that would have required her to acknowledge the situation as anything other than what it practically was. He had made space. He had returned his attention to the front of the church. He had waited for her to decide what she was going to do. She had sat down. And for the first time in 11 months, the distance between them was the width of a pew. He had sat with that for the length of the service, aware of her beside him with the specific quality of awareness that was different from 11 months of peripheral observation, the awareness of proximity rather than distance, the awareness of a person rather than a presence at the edge of his attention. He had not looked at her during the service. He had not needed to. He had been aware of the specific quality of her stillness beside him, which was different from the stillness he had observed from across the aisle, was more effortful, was the stillness of someone managing something rather than simply being still, and he had understood from the quality of the management that the proximity was costing her something, and that the right response to what it was costing her was to make his own presence as unremarkable as possible, which was what he did. The service ended. He had put on his hat, and he had turned to her, because not turning to her after sitting beside her for an hour and a half empty church on a snowstorm Sunday would have been its own specific kind of rudeness. And he had said, in the specific plain quiet voice that was simply his voice, "I don't think we've been introduced." He had said, "My name is Ford Callahan." She had looked at him for a moment with the hazel eyes that were at the distance of the same pew rather than across the aisle. The most specific thing about her face, the thing that showed most clearly the interior of someone who had been managing her interior very carefully for a very long time, and was currently managing the specific surprise of being addressed directly by a man she had been aware of for 11 months without looking at him directly. She had said Nora Vale. 2 words. Her name. Offered with the careful brevity of someone who was not certain what the offering was going to cost them, and who was keeping the initial investment modest as a precaution. He had nodded. He had said, "The snow's going to be worse before it gets better." She had said, "I know." He had said, "You're welcome to wait it out here if you need to." She had looked at him again, the hazel eyes doing the careful work of someone assessing a statement for its genuine content rather than its surface meaning, and he had let the looking happen without trying to assist it or hurry it because the looking was her process and her process was not his to manage. Then she had said, "Thank you." And that was the beginning. Not of anything dramatic. Not of anything that announced itself as significant in the moment of its happening. But the beginning nonetheless. The specific small beginning of 2 people who have been in the same room for 11 months without speaking, and who have just, in the specific compressed social circumstance of a bad snowstorm and one available pew, finally said each other's names. Ford Callahan had known, from the moment she said her name with the careful brevity of someone rationing their offering, that he was going to need more patience than he had needed for anything in a very long time. He had it. He was certain of that. What he was less certain of was whether the having of it was going to be enough, or whether the specific thing that the patience was in service of was something he had the right to want at all. He rode home in the snow thinking about it. He did not arrive at an answer, but he arrived at the understanding that the question was no longer something he could manage by not asking it. The snow did not let up. It had been clear from the quality of it when Nora had walked to the church that morning, the specific heavy wet snow of a Colorado December that was not the light decorative snow of early winter, but the serious committed snow of a storm that had decided on something and intended to follow through, that the walk home was not going to be the same walk in reverse. She had understood this when she left the house. She had come anyway because the Sunday routine was the organizing structure of her week in the specific way that routines become organizing structures when they are the only consistent voluntary external commitment remaining in a life that has reduced its voluntary external commitments to the minimum compatible with continued residence in a community. And disrupting the routine would have required a reason that felt like surrender to the weather rather than a considered choice. And she had enough experience with surrender to be wary of practicing it unnecessarily. The church had emptied around them during the final hymn, the congregation moving toward the doors with the practical urgency of people who understood the snow's intentions and had their own intentions about getting home before those intentions fully materialized. Nora had stood with the others and had moved toward the door and had stepped outside into the specific quality of a Colorado snowstorm in December that was, by the time the service ended, considerably more serious than it had been when she had arrived. The wind had come up. The visibility had reduced to something that made the familiar 2-block walk between the church and her rented rooms on Callaway Street into a prospect that was no longer simply unpleasant, but genuinely unwise for a slim woman in church clothes with no escort and no particular knowledge of what the footing under the new snow was like. She had stood on the church steps for a moment, which was longer than she usually stood anywhere she was likely to be seen or spoken to. And she had assessed the situation with the practical intelligence she brought to all assessments of difficult situations. And she had arrived at a conclusion she did not want to arrive at, which was that going back inside to wait out the worst of it was the sensible choice, rather than the choice of someone who was avoiding the things she was avoiding. He was still inside. She had known this without looking because his horse was still at the hitching post, and no horse that size belonged to anyone else in Harlan Falls. She had stood on the steps for a moment longer than the assessment strictly required, and then she had gone back in. Because the sensible choice was the sensible choice regardless of what it cost her in the specific currency of managed proximity. He was at the end of the pew, his hat back on his head and his coat buttoned, looking at the front of the church with the specific quality of someone who had not assumed that she would return and had not been waiting for her, but who registered her return without any of the social performance that would have made the registering into an occasion. He looked at her when she came back through the door. He said nothing. He moved to the far end of the pew again with the same unhurried deliberateness as before. She sat. The church was empty now except for the two of them and old Reverend Marsh, who had disappeared into the small room behind the pulpit with the specific efficiency of a man who had presided over 40 Wyoming and Colorado winters, and who understood that the congregation's practical concerns superseded his social ones. The wind pressed against the windows. The stove in the corner of the church put out its modest heat with the modest efficiency of a stove that had been designed for a full congregation and was currently serving 2 people, which meant the church was not warm exactly but was considerably warmer than the street outside. She sat with her hands in her lap and her coat still on, and her eyes on the front of the church in the characteristic mode, and she waited for him to say something that would require her to manage it. Because that was what people did in enforced proximity. They said things that required management. And she had been managing things for 11 months, and she was proficient at it, but she was also, in a way she had not examined directly because the examination would have required more interior surplus than she had been running. Tired of the proficiency. He did not say anything. He sat at the far end of the pew with his hat on and his large hands resting on his knees and his gray eyes on the front of the church in a mirror of her own posture that she was aware of in the peripheral vision she was using to monitor him without appearing to monitor him. And he was simply present in the space with the specific quality of someone for whom presence required no supplementation, who did not need to fill silence to justify it or to make it comfortable, because his relationship with silence was already comfortable and did not need her to do anything about it. 10 minutes passed. The snow continued. The stove made its modest efforts. She became aware, in the specific incremental way of someone whose peripheral attention has been monitoring something and whose peripheral attention has now reached the limit of what peripheral monitoring can accommodate, that she was going to have to either look at him directly or continue the pretense of not looking at him. And the pretense was using more of the interior surplus she did not have than the looking would have cost. She turned her head. He was already looking at her. Not with the particular social intention of someone who had been waiting for her to turn, not with anything that required a specific response, simply looking, in the direct, unhurried way that was apparently simply how he looked at things, with the gray eyes that were, at the distance of a shared pew in a nearly empty church, considerably more than she had allowed herself to register from across an aisle. She said, because the silence had reached the point where saying nothing was its own form of statement, "How long do you think it will last?" He considered the question with the same unhurried quality he appeared to bring to everything. He said, "The worst of it, another hour. Maybe 2, he said. It'll ease off after that." She said, "You've seen storms like this before." He said, "A few." He said, "Texas gets them different. Colorado gets them like this." She said, "You're from Texas." He said, "Originally." He said, 3 years here." She looked at the windows, at the specific white quality of the light coming through them. That was the light of heavy snowfall rather than the usual light of a December morning. She said, "I haven't been here 3 years." He said, "I know." He said it in the specific plain way of someone stating a fact rather than revealing a surveillance. And she looked at him, and he looked back. And there was a moment that was not quite anything nameable, but that had a specific quality of honesty in it. The honesty of 2 people who have been aware of each other for a long time and have just acknowledged the awareness directly for the first time. She said, "You sit on the right side every week." He said, "The pew fits?" She said, "I noticed." He said, "I know you did." She said, "Did you notice me noticing?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't say anything." He said, "You weren't saying anything to anyone." He said, I didn't see why I should be different. Something in her expression shifted at that. A small shift. The specific shift of someone receiving something they had not expected to receive, and that was arriving in a form that did not require them to manage it into something safe because it was already exactly what it was. She said most people assume that not talking to them is an invitation. He said most people assume a lot of things. She said you don't. He said I try not to. She looked at him for a moment with the hazel eyes doing their careful work, and he sat with the looking in the specific way he sat with most things, which was completely and without filling the space the looking required with anything that would have hurried it. She said, Nora Vale. He said, I remember. She said, you said your name first. He said, seemed like the right order. She said, why he considered this. He said, because I'm the one who moved to the end of the pew. He said, the person who changes the arrangement introduces themselves first. It seemed like a reasonable rule. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, that is a very specific rule. He said, I have a lot of specific rules. She said about church pew arrangements. He said, among other things. It was, she understood, the beginning of something that was not quite conversation and not quite the managed exchange of social pleasantries that she had become practiced at deploying as a substitute for conversation, but something between the two. The specific tentative quality of two people who are discovering, with some surprise, that the space between them is not as uncomfortable as the previous 11 months of carefully maintained distance had suggested it would be. Reverend Marsh appeared from the back room with 2 cups of something hot, which he set on the end of the front pew without comment, and then disappeared again with the specific efficiency of a man who had been ministering to communities in difficult weather for 40 years and who understood that the most useful thing he could do for 2 people waiting out a snowstorm in his church was to provide hot coffee and then remove himself from the vicinity. Ford stood and retrieved both cups and brought one to her end of the pew, setting it within her reach without pressing it on her, and returned to his end and wrapped his large hands around the other one. She took the cup. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter in the way of coffee that had been sitting on a stove for the better part of a morning, and it was hot, and the hot was what mattered. She said, thank you. He said, Marsh makes terrible coffee. She said, it's hot. He said, that's the best thing I can say about it. She looked at the cup and then at him, and something happened at the corners of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the general vicinity of the capacity for one. And he received it without commenting on it, because commenting on it would have been the wrong response, and he understood what the wrong response was. He said after they had been quiet for a few minutes with the coffee and the snow against the windows, how long have you been in Harlan Falls? She said, 11 months, he said, since January. She said yes. He did not ask about the January because the quality of the word she had used to say it told him the January was not a neutral month and that asking about it was not what the moment required. He said it's a good town. She said it's a town. He said, that's true. He said most places are, mostly. She looked at him. She said, that is a complicated thing to say about a place. He said, I've lived in a few places. He said, they're mostly towns. They have good people and difficult people and more opinions than events to justify the opinions, and they're mostly the same and mostly different. She said, which is Harlan Falls? He thought about this honestly. He said more good than difficult. He said the opinions outpace the events, same as anywhere. He said, but I've been here 3 years and it's held up. She said, held up to what? He said, to the finding out. He said, every place looks different once you've been through a full year of it. He said, some places don't hold up to the finding out. He said, Harlan Falls mostly does. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I haven't found that. He said, no. He said it simply, not as a contradiction or a challenge or a comfort, just as the plain acknowledgement of a thing she had said that was probably true and that he was not going to argue with or try to revise. She looked at him, and the hazel eyes were doing something different from the careful management they had been doing, were showing something that was not quite openness, but was the specific expression of someone who has been seen accurately and is deciding what to do about the accuracy. She said, why didn't you say anything? For 11 months, he said. I told you, she said. You said because I wasn't saying anything to anyone. He said, that's true. She said, is that the whole of it? He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was finding the honest answer rather than the available answer. He said, no. She said, what's the rest? He said, the rest is that I know what loneliness looks like when I see it. He said, and the thing about loneliness is that it doesn't need someone walking across an aisle toward it uninvited. He said it needs someone to be on the other side of the aisle long enough that crossing it eventually stops being a thing that needs courage. She looked at him for a long time, the snow pressed against the windows. The stove burned its modest heat. The coffee had gone slightly less hot in their hands. She said, how do you know what loneliness looks like? He said, the same way anyone knows what something looks like after they've lived inside it long enough. The sentence sat between them in the cold church with the storm outside and the bad coffee and the specific quality of a moment that had not been planned and had not been constructed and that had the specific weight of things that arrive through circumstance rather than intention and that are therefore, when they arrive, more honest than anything that has been arranged in advance. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was longer than most moments and that had more inside it than the available silence should have been able to hold. She said, "Eventually the snow is easing." He looked at the windows. He said, "A little." He said, "Another 20 minutes and it'll be manageable." She said, "All right." She said, "I'll wait 20 minutes." He said, "I'll walk you back when it's time." She started to say she did not need walking back, and then she stopped. Because the starting of the sentence had produced in her the specific recognition of someone who is about to deploy a reflex rather than make a genuine choice. And she held the reflex and looked at what was underneath it, which was not a genuine preference for walking home alone in the snow, but the specific habit of refusing things before they could be withdrawn. And she recognized the habit and she put the reflex down. She said, "All right." He said nothing. He drank his terrible coffee. She drank hers. The snow eased in the windows by degrees, and 20 minutes later he stood and she stood and they walked out of the church together into the specific quiet that a heavy snowfall left in its aftermath. The muffled quality of a world that had been rearranged by the weather and that was still in the process of determining what it looked like now. He walked beside her the 2 blocks to Callaway Street. He was so much larger than her that the scale of it was simply a fact of the space between them, and he walked with the specific careful deliberateness of a man who was aware of his own dimensions and who was managing the awareness in her direction without making the management visible. She walked beside him and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the specific quality of the nothing was different from the nothing of 11 months of Sundays, was warmer somehow. Was the nothing of 2 people who have said some things and are now in the specific proximity of the things they have said, rather than the things they have not. At the door of her building he stopped. She stopped. She said, "Thank you for the walk." He said, "Of course," she said. "And for the pew." He said, "The pew was the storm's doing." She said, "The company was yours." He looked at her with the gray eyes and the specific quality of the post-storm light that was flat and pale and honest, in the way that light was honest, after a storm had simplified everything. He said, "Same time next Sunday." It was not quite a question. She said, "I'm always there." He said, "I know." He put his hat back on, which he had taken off at some point between the church and the door without her noticing when, and he turned and walked back toward the church and his horse with the unhurried deliberateness that was simply how he moved through the world, and she stood at her door and watched him go with the specific quality of someone who has just been through something they had not anticipated and who is still in the process of determining what it was. She went inside. She stood in the hallway of her rooms for a moment before taking off her coat. She looked at her hands and they were cold from the walk, and she thought about what he had said. About loneliness and what it looked like when you had lived inside it long enough to recognize it. And she thought about the 11 months of Sundays and the specific patience of someone who had been on the other side of an aisle for all of them and had said nothing. Not because he had not noticed, but because he had noticed specifically enough to understand that the saying nothing was the right thing. She had been noticed for 11 months. She had not known. The not knowing had been its own specific form of something she did not have a name for yet, but that she could feel in the specific place behind her sternum where the things that mattered tended to make themselves known. She took off her coat. She put on the kettle. She sat at the table in the specific quality of a Sunday afternoon after an unexpected thing. And she thought about the next Sunday. And for the first time in 11 months, the thinking about the next Sunday did not have the specific quality of obligation that it had carried for all the previous Sundays, but something else. Something that she was not ready to name, but that she could feel, small and tentative and entirely real, beginning to be present in the space where the obligation had always been. The following Sunday was clear. The snow from the previous week had settled into the specific hard-packed quality of December snow that had been walked on and frozen and walked on again. And the road into town was manageable in the way that Colorado winter roads were manageable when the storm had passed and the cold had organized itself into something stable rather than something in motion. Nora walked to church at her usual time, which was later than most of the congregation and earlier than she would have preferred if preference rather than strategy had been guiding the decision. And she walked with the specific quality of someone who has not changed the outward form of their routine, but who is aware in the interior that something in the relationship between the routine and herself has shifted without her having made a decision about the shifting. She arrived at the church and she went to the third pew from the back on the left, and she sat down and she put her hands in her lap and she directed her attention to the front of the church in the characteristic mode. He was already there. He was always already there when she arrived, had been always already there for 11 months, and she had never allowed herself to note this as a specific fact about his attendance rather than a general feature of the environment. But she noted it now with the specific attention of someone who has begun to see things they were previously managing not to see. He was on the right side of the aisle in the third pew from the back, which was where he always was, with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes forward, and he did not look at her when she came in. He looked at her when the service ended. Not immediately, not with the particular social intention of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity, but in the natural way of the turning and gathering of a congregation dispersing. And when his eyes found her, they did not perform the finding. He nodded once. She nodded once. The aisle between them was the width of an aisle again, which was the width it had always been, and she was aware, in a way she had not been aware before the previous Sunday, that the width of the aisle was a fact rather than a fixed condition, that it had been crossed once and could be crossed again, and that the awareness of that crossability was itself a change in her relationship to the aisle. She was almost at the door when she heard him behind her, not in the particular way of someone following, but in the natural way of a large man moving through a dispersing congregation at the pace the crowd permitted. She stepped outside and he was beside her on the steps, which was where he had not been on any of the previous Sundays, because on the previous Sundays she had already been off the steps and moving down the street, before most of the congregation had finished the final hymn. He said, "Clear this week." She said, "Yes." He said, "Road was better." She said, "It was." He said, "You walked." She said, "I always walk." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Your boots." He said it without elaboration, as the plain statement of a specific observation, and she looked at her boots, which were the practical lace-up leather boots she wore every Sunday, and which were, she understood, the boots of someone who walked rather than the boots of someone who rode, and she understood that he had noted this detail across 11 months of Sundays with the same comprehensive attentiveness that had apparently noted everything else. She said, "You pay attention." He said, "It's a habit." She said, "To specific things or to everything?" He considered this honestly. He said, "Everything. Mostly." He said, "Some things more than others." She did not ask him which category she fell into, because she understood the answer, and asking would have made him say it, which would have made her have to receive it, and she was not yet ready to receive it in the specific plain form he would have delivered it in. She said, "I should get back." He said, "I know." He said, "Same time next week." It was the same not quite question as the previous week, and she gave it the same answer, which was not an answer but a confirmation. She said, "I'm always there." She walked home. The Sunday had the same external form as the previous 50-something Sundays and a completely different interior quality, and she carried the difference home with her and set it on the kitchen table alongside her coat and her gloves, and she looked at it for a while in the way you looked at things that had arrived without your having arranged for them to arrive and that you were not yet certain what to do with. The Sundays developed a pattern across December that was different from the pattern of the previous 11 months, in the specific way that things were different when a small but real change had been introduced to a system that had been static. She still arrived late. She still sat on the left side of the aisle in the third pew from the back. She still left before the social gathering on the steps had fully formed, but she left a few minutes later than she had previously left, and in those few minutes she had, twice more before Christmas, a brief exchange with Ford Callahan on the church steps in the specific register of two people who have established a minimal but genuine acquaintance and who are adding to it in the small increments that were the only increments available in the specific social circumstances of a Sunday morning between two people who were both, for their own reasons, managing how much they added and when. He had said something on the second Sunday after the storm that had stayed with her across the week in the way that things stayed when they had found a specific place to settle. They had been on the steps in the December cold, and she had said something about the sermon, which had been about the specific comfort of community in the winter months, and he had said, in the plain direct way he said most things, community's a complicated comfort for some people. She had looked at him. He had said, "It asks you to be present in it in ways that aren't always available." She had said, "You sound like you know that." He had said, "I've been in communities where I wasn't present in the right way." He had said, or where the presence I had available didn't match what was being asked for. She had understood from the quality of what he said and the quality of how he said it, that he was not speaking theoretically and was not making a general observation about the human condition, but was telling her something specific about his own experience in the specific plain way he told her everything, and she had received it with the careful attention she was beginning to understand was the appropriate reception for what he offered. She had started to learn the shape of him across the December Sundays, not in the way of someone constructing an understanding of a person for purposes of their own, but in the natural way that two people in repeated proximity to each other began to accumulate knowledge of each other through the specific evidence of the accumulating occasions. She knew he arrived before her every Sunday. She knew he sat at the far right end of the pew, even when the church was full and the pew was crowded, which required him to press against the wall in a way that was clearly uncomfortable, but that he managed without complaint, which told her something about his relationship to his own discomfort and other people's convenience. She knew he removed his hat the moment he entered the church and did not put it back on until he was outside, which was a specific courtesy that not all the men of the congregation observed consistently. She knew his voice was low enough that she sometimes did not hear the full content of what he said in the ambient noise of the post-service gathering, but could always hear the quality of it, which was the same quality in every register, considered, unhurried, specific. She had not seen him outside of Sunday mornings. That was the specific boundary of their acquaintance. The church steps and the brief exchanges and the occasional shared pew in bad weather, and the boundary had an integrity she respected because it had not been imposed but had simply been the natural result of two people whose daily lives did not overlap in the ordinary way of a small town's daily life. Her life being organized around the rented rooms on Callaway Street and the occasional errands that the maintenance of a solitary domestic existence required, and his life being organized around the Callahan spread 12 miles outside of town, which kept him outside of Harlan Falls for most of the week's working days. The boundary was crossed for the first time on a Wednesday in the third week of December, through the ordinary channel of a small town where everyone's shopping occurred at the same mercantile, and where the mercantile was, on the Wednesday before Christmas, considerably more crowded than its usual capacity was designed to accommodate. She was reaching for a tin on the upper shelf that was exactly 1 inch above the height she could reach without straining, which she was currently straining for with the specific focused effort of someone who was not going to ask for help if not asking for help was technically feasible, when a large hand reached past her from above and took the tin from the shelf and set it in her basket with the specific economy of movement of someone for whom the reaching had been entirely effortless and who was not making an occasion of it. She turned. He was there in the way he was always there, which was without announcement, with his hat on and his coat on and a small list in one large hand that was clearly a supply list of the kind that working ranches generated. And he said, "Sorry for the reach." She said, "You saved me the strain." He said, "I figured." He did not elaborate on what he had figured, which she understood to mean that he had observed the straining before he had reached and had assessed it as something that was going to result in either the tin or her balance being compromised, and had acted accordingly without making a performance of the acting. She said, "Are you in town often?" He said, "Wednesdays usually." He said, "Supply run?" She said, "I didn't know that." He said, "There's no reason you would." She said, "I suppose not." She said, "Do you always come to this mercantile?" He said, "It's the only one." She said, "Right?" She said, "I knew that." He said, "You've been here 11 months. She said, "I don't always pay attention to the practical geography." He said, "I've noticed." He said it with the specific dry quality that was his version of humor. The humor that was so understated it was easy to miss if you were not paying attention, and she recognized it because she had been paying attention, and she said, "Is that a criticism?" He said, "It's an observation." She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of someone who moves through a place without quite landing in it." She looked at him. She said, "That's accurate." He said, "I know." He said, "I've been watching you not land for 11 months. She said, "Is that what it looks like from the outside?" He said, "From where I've been sitting?" "Yes." She said, "What does landing look like?" He thought about this honestly. He said, "Like, you're here because you chose to be here rather than because leaving seemed harder." She said, "That's a specific distinction." He said, "It's the relevant one." She stood with the tin in her basket and the mercantile busy around them, and the specific quality of a conversation that had arrived further in 5 minutes of the mercantile on a Wednesday than 11 months of Sunday mornings had managed. And she understood that the arriving further was connected to the Wednesday quality of it. The non-Sunday quality, the quality of two people encountering each other in the ordinary, middle of an ordinary week rather than in the specific managed frame of the Sunday morning that she had been constructing and maintaining with such care. She said, "Do you always say exactly what you mean?" He said, "I try to." He said, "It saves time." She said, "It also requires something from the person you're saying it to." He said, "Yes." He said, "I try to only say it to people I think can receive it," she said. "And you think I can receive it?" He said, You've been receiving it? She said. I've been trying to. He said, that's the same thing. Mostly. She looked at him for a moment in the crowded mercantile with the specific quality of attention she was learning was his consistent quality, the full weight of it. And she said, you're a very specific person, Ford Callahan. He said, I've been told. She said, I don't mean it as a criticism. He said, I know. He said, same way I didn't mean it as a criticism when I said you weren't landing. She said, truce, then. He said, I wasn't aware we were fighting. She said, we weren't. She said, I just wanted to establish that we weren't. He said, established. She said, good. And something happened in her face that was closer to a genuine expression than anything she had produced in the social encounters of 11 months of Harlan Falls. Something warm and slightly surprised at its own warmth, and he received it with the specific quality of someone receiving something carefully because they understand its value. He said, I'll be in town next Wednesday. He said it without the particular social construction of an invitation, as the simple statement of a fact that she could do with what she chose, and she understood that this was his characteristic mode of offering things, which was the mode of someone who made what was available known without attaching a requirement to the knowing. She said, I'm usually at the mercantile Wednesday afternoons. He said, I'll look for you. She said, all right. He nodded. He took his supply list and his basket to the counter. She completed her own errands with the specific quality of someone who is doing a familiar task in an unfamiliar interior state, who is going through the motions of the routine with the reliable competence of long practice, while the part of her that had nothing to do with the routine was occupied with something else entirely. She walked home. The December afternoon was clear and cold, and the specific gold of late winter light at low angle on snow was doing what it did to the main street of Harlan Falls, which was to make the ordinary beautiful in the specific way that beautiful light on ordinary things produced, and she noticed it, which was the first time in 11 months that she had noticed the quality of the afternoon light on the main street of Harlan Falls with the specific attention of someone who was present in the noticing rather than moving through it. She noticed that she had noticed. She was aware that the noticing was connected to the conversation in the mercantile and to the Wednesday quality of it. The specific, ordinary, unexpected Wednesday quality of a conversation that had arrived without the frame that she had been using to manage the Sunday ones. And she walked home thinking about what Ford Callahan had said about landing in a place because you chose to be there rather than because leaving seemed harder. And she thought about it the way she thought about things that had found a specific place to settle, which was with the full attention she rarely gave to the interior of her own experience, because giving the interior the full attention had been, for 11 months, the specific things she could not afford to do. She could feel, walking home in the gold December light, that something was changing in what she could afford. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from the outside, but in the specific way of an interior shift that had no external evidence yet, but that she could feel as a genuine change in the quality of what was available to her. A small increment of surplus in the emotional ledger that had been running at zero for a very long time, and that was, in the specific way of small increments that were real rather than performed, beginning to show a different number. She did not know what to do with the different number yet. She did not need to know yet. She only needed to notice it. She noticed it. She carried it home with her in the gold December light, and she set it on the kitchen table alongside her coat and her gloves and the tin that a large, careful hand had taken from the shelf above her reach, without making an occasion of it. And she looked at all of it together for a long moment before she put the kettle on, and went about the rest of the Wednesday with the specific quality of someone who is still doing the same things they have always done, but who is doing them from a slightly different position than before. A position that is, in the specific, incremental way of things that are genuinely changing, a little closer to the ground. January arrived in Harlan Falls with the specific authority of a Colorado mountain winter that had decided to be fully itself and had no remaining patience for the transitional qualities of December. The cold settled into the valley with the permanent quality of something that had made a decision and intended to keep it through March, and the town organized itself around the cold with the practiced efficiency of a community that had been through this before and understood what it required. The days were short, and the light was low, and the specific quality of the social life of a mountain town in deep winter was the quality of things drawing inward, of the communal life condensing from the broad outdoor casualness of the warmer months into the more deliberate indoor warmth of people who were choosing to be together rather than simply ending up in the same place. Nora had been in Harlan Falls through one previous January. She had managed it the way she managed everything, which was with the focused competence of someone who had reduced their requirements to the minimum and was meeting the minimum with the minimum necessary engagement. This January was different from the previous one in the specific way that things were different when a small but real change had been introduced. The same way that December had been different from the 11 months before the snowstorm Sunday, and the difference was not dramatic and was not resolved and was not something she would have been able to point to for an outside observer. But it was present, and she could feel its presence in the specific quality of the mornings, which were less purely functional than they had been and were beginning to contain small moments of something that was not the management of the day, but the actual inhabiting of it. The Wednesday mercantile encounters had continued through December and into the new year. They had become, without either of them arranging for them to become this, one of the organizing rhythms of her week, in the specific way that things became organizing rhythms when they were consistent and when the consistency produced something that the week was better for having. He was always there when he said he would be there, which was itself a form of information about him that she had been accumulating since the snowstorm Sunday, and that had settled in the interior place where she was building her understanding of who he actually was, as distinct from the initial peripheral impression of a large, quiet man on the opposite side of a church aisle. He was reliable in the specific way that was not the reliability of someone who had organized their behavior for an audience, but the reliability of someone for whom showing up when they said they would show up was simply a baseline condition of how they operated in the world. They talked in the mercantile on the Wednesdays with the specific quality of conversation that had been developing since the snowstorm Sunday, the quality that was not the careful managed exchange of social pleasantries, but something that went further than that moved in the direction of actual content rather than the social scaffolding that usually substituted for content in brief public encounters. He asked questions that told her he had been thinking about what she had said the previous week and had arrived at something he wanted to know more about, and she answered the questions with the specific quality of attention she was learning to give to things she was asked by someone who was actually interested in the answer rather than asking as a form of social maintenance. She asked him questions, too, with the growing confidence of someone discovering that the asking was not going to produce the specific kind of response that made asking inadvisable, which was the response that converted the question into an opportunity to redirect the conversation toward the questioner's own concerns. He told her about the ranch in January, about the specific demands of a Colorado cattle operation in deep winter, and the telling had the quality she had come to recognize as his characteristic quality when he talked about things he knew well, which was the quality of genuine mastery delivering itself without performance, without the particular pride of someone demonstrating expertise, but with the specific plain authority of someone for whom the expertise was simply the result of sustained attention to a thing over time. She listened with the full quality she had been learning to give to things that deserved the full quality, and she asked about the parts she did not understand, and he answered those questions with the same plain authority, and the conversations accumulated across the January Wednesdays into something that was beginning to look, from the inside, like the early stages of a friendship, which was a category she had not been accepting applications for, and that had apparently applied anyway. She told him things about herself in January that she had not told anyone in Harlan Falls. Not the large things, not the full interior accounting of the complicated grief she had been carrying, but the adjacent things, the things that were close enough to the center of it to communicate its shape without requiring her to name it directly. She told him about Ohio, about the specific quality of her family and the specific warmth of the household she had grown up in, and the telling had the specific quality of someone accessing a part of their history they had not visited in some time and finding it more intact than they had feared. She told him about the books she had loved as a child, about the particular pleasure of a well-made sentence that she had carried from her father's reading habits, and that had never entirely left her even in the months when the reading itself had felt like too much effort. She told him about the garden she had kept at the house she and Robert had shared for the first 2 years of the marriage, before the years that had been harder, a garden that had been genuinely hers in the specific way of things you build with your own hands and that respond to your specific attention rather than to any attention. He listened to all of it with the complete quality that was his specific characteristic and that she had come to rely on as a consistent fact of his presence, and he said things in response that told her he had understood not just the content of what she said, but the thing beneath the content, the specific emotional geography that the content was mapping. He said when she told him about the Ohio household and the specific warmth of it, that the warmth of the place you grew up was the standard against which everything after got measured, whether you wanted it to be or not. She said, "Is that what happened to you?" He said, "I spent a long time looking for something that matched the standard." He said, "I've been less focused on the matching and more focused on the building since I came here." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Matching requires the original to be the measure." He said, "Building lets you set your own measure." She said, "Have you set yours?" He said, "I'm working on it." He said it with a specific plain quality that told her the working on it was genuine and ongoing and not resolved. And she received that honesty with the specific quality of someone receiving something that confirms a trust they have been extending carefully and finding it confirmed. The deepening had a quality she had not anticipated when it began, which was the quality of something that was not producing in her the specific anxiety that she had expected it to produce. She had expected that the closer the acquaintance came to the actual interior of her experience, the more the management required would increase, the more the careful architecture of her self-containment would strain under the weight of proximity. Instead, she found that the architecture was under less strain in the Wednesday conversations and the Sunday exchanges than it was in any other encounter she had in the week, which was itself a form of information about what was happening and about who he was. She thought about this on a January evening after a Wednesday that had gone further in its conversation than any previous Wednesday. A conversation in which she had said something about Robert. That was the first time she had said anything about Robert to anyone in Harlan Falls, something small and adjacent to the truth of the marriage rather than the truth itself, and he had received it with the same complete quality and had said something in return that had not been the performance of sympathy or the management of her disclosure into something more comfortable, but simply the honest response of someone who had understood what she was actually saying. She thought about it and she understood in the specific way of someone arriving at a conclusion they have been approaching gradually, that what was happening was something she had not chosen and had not arranged for, and that had arrived anyway through the specific channel of a bad snowstorm and one available church pew, and that the not choosing and the not arranging were part of what made it what it was. She also understood, in the same January evening, that the understanding was beginning to require something from her that she had not yet determined whether she was capable of providing, which was the willingness to let it continue becoming what it was becoming, without the management that had been her primary available mode for the past year and more. She sat with this understanding for a long time. She did not resolve it that evening. She carried it forward into the weeks that followed with the specific patient attention of someone for whom the carrying of things that were not yet ready to be resolved was a practiced capability. And she let it be what it was without forcing it into a conclusion before the conclusion was ready to form on its own. The darkest moment arrived on the last Sunday of January, in the form of the specific social pressure that small communities generated when they had observed something long enough to have decided they had an opinion about it. It arrived through Mrs. Carver, who was one of the central figures of the church's women's society, and who was a woman of genuine warmth and considerable social confidence, and whose concern for the community's members was entirely sincere and entirely organized around a framework that was the framework of her time and place, and that had, on this particular Sunday morning, concluded that the situation required her to say something to Nora Vale. Mrs. Carver approached her after the service, on the steps, with the specific combination of warmth and purposefulness of a woman who has decided that kindness requires her to say something she believes you need to hear, she said, with the warm directness of someone who saw directness as a form of respect. "My dear, I hope you won't take this wrongly, because it comes entirely from care." She said, "People have been noticing that you and Ford Callahan have been talking after services, and that you've been seen together at the Mercantile on Wednesdays. And while I'm certain it's entirely proper, you'll understand that a widow in your position needs to be careful about how things appear, because appearances in a small community are a form of currency, and once spent, they're difficult to recover." She said all of this with the complete sincerity of someone who believed she was performing a service. Nora received it with the composed grace of 11 months of practice. She thanked Mrs. Carver for her concern. She said the appropriate things. She watched Mrs. Carver move away with the warm satisfaction of a woman whose social conscience had been discharged. And she stood on the church steps for a moment in the cold January air with a specific quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness. That was the stillness of something having arrived that she had known, in some part of herself, was coming, and that was no less difficult for having been anticipated. She walked home. She did not look at the right side of the aisle as she left the church. She did not look for Ford Callahan on the steps. She walked the 2 blocks to Calloway Street with the controlled pace of someone managing something until they were in a position to feel it. And she went into her rooms, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she sat with it for a long time in the specific cold clarity of a January afternoon. She thought about what Mrs. Carver had said, and she thought about the currency of appearances, and she thought about the specific social architecture of a small town and how it organized itself around the management of its members' behavior. And she thought about all of this with the clear, practical intelligence she brought to the assessment of difficult situations. And what she arrived at was not the distress she might have expected, but the specific colder clarity of someone who has just been reminded, in the language of kindness, of the particular constraints of her position. She had been a widow in Harlan Falls for a year. She had managed that position with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that the management was the primary available protection against the specific vulnerabilities that the position created. She had constructed the invisibility and maintained it, and it had served its purpose, and now something was happening that was in direct tension with the invisibility, and she was going to have to make a decision about the tension that she had not planned to make this soon, and that she was not certain she was ready to make. She thought about Ford Callahan. She thought about the snowstorm Sunday, and the specific plain quality of the first conversation, and the January Wednesdays, and what he had said about loneliness, and what he had said about landing in a place, and what he had said about building versus matching, and she thought about the specific quality of what it felt like to be in conversation with someone who was actually interested in what she was saying. And she thought about the fact that she had been alone for a year, and that the alone had been the right thing, and that it had also been, in a way she was only now finding the vocabulary for, the specific kind of alone that was past its natural duration. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she did something she had not done since the previous January, which was to cry, genuinely and without management, not for the grief that she had been carrying or for Robert or for the marriage or for any of the large things that had been the legitimate contents of the previous year's grief, but for the smaller thing, the specific smaller thing of being a woman who had been alone for a year and who had found, in the specific unexpected channel of a bad snowstorm and a church pew and a large quiet man with gray eyes, something she had not been looking for, and that was now in direct tension with the specific management system she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of thing. She cried for a while. Then she stopped. With the specific efficiency of someone for whom crying had always been a private and time-limited process. She washed her face. She made tea. She sat back at the kitchen table and she looked at the question that was on the table in front of her, which was not the question of what Mrs. Carver had said, but the question that Mrs. Carver's saying had forced into visibility, which was the question of what she was going to do about the thing that was happening. And whether the doing required courage she was not certain she had, or simply the specific kind of honesty that she had been building, incrementally and without planning, across the January Wednesdays. She did not answer the question that afternoon. She carried it forward into the week with the patient attention she had learned to bring to things that were not yet ready to be resolved. And she thought about it in the mornings before the day required anything from her, and in the evenings when the day was finished and the kitchen was quiet, and the specific quality of the January night pressed against the windows with the cold insistence of a season that was not going to ease for some time yet. On Wednesday she went to the mercantile. He was there. He looked at her when she came in with the gray eyes and the specific quality of attention that was simply his attention, that did not perform itself or adjust itself or require anything from her in return for its quality, and she understood, looking at him across the crowded Wednesday mercantile, that the question was not whether she had the courage, and was not whether she was ready, and was not whether the social architecture of Harlan Falls was going to generate an opinion about whatever happened next. The question was whether she was going to let the specific management system she had built to protect herself continue to do the thing it had been built to do, which was to protect her from exactly this, or whether she was going to look at what it was protecting her from and decide that the protection was no longer worth the cost. She looked at him across the mercantile. He was waiting for her to decide. He had been waiting? She understood. For considerably longer than this Wednesday, with the specific patient quality of someone for whom waiting was not passive, but was its own form of presence. And the waiting had its own specific weight, and the weight of it was something she was going to have to address. She walked across the mercantile toward him. It was not a long walk. It was 12 feet, perhaps 15, but it was the furthest she had walked toward anything in a year, and she was aware of every step of it. And she took each step with the specific deliberate quality of someone who has made a decision and is executing it without looking back. Because looking back was not the thing the moment required, and she had decided, somewhere in the specific quiet of the January nights, that she was done letting the management make decisions that were hers to make. He watched her cross the 12 or 15 feet. He did not move toward her. He understood she had come to believe the specific importance of letting her make the crossing, of not meeting her halfway in a way that would have distributed the courage required and therefore diluted the specific meaning of the choosing. She arrived at where he was standing and she looked up at him, which was simply the geometry of being near him, and she said, "Mrs. Carver spoke to me after church on Sunday." He said, "I heard." She said, "What did you hear?" He said that she spoke to you. She said, "What do you know about what she said?" He said, "Enough." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I've been thinking about it." He said, "What have you decided?" And she understood that this was the question, the specific plain question that cut through everything else to the actual matter, which was not what Mrs. Carver had said, but what she was going to do about what Mrs. Carver had said. And she stood in the Wednesday Mercantile with the question in front of her, and she gave it the answer she had arrived at across the January nights. She said, "I've decided that I'm tired of being managed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Managed by who?" She said, "By myself." He looked at her with the gray eyes and the full quality of his attention and something in his expression, which was characteristically still and characteristically unreadable to anyone who had not been paying the specific quality of attention she had been paying, shifted in the specific way that things shifted in him when something mattered, which was barely visibly and entirely genuinely. He said, "That's the most important thing you've said to me." She said, "I know." She said, "I'm still afraid." He said, "I know." He said, "That's not the same thing as not being ready." She said, "No." She said, "It's not." February in the Colorado mountains was the month that tested everything. Not dramatically, not with the particular spectacular violence of the storms that November and December produced, but with the specific sustained severity of a cold that had been in place long enough to have become the baseline condition of the world, and that showed no immediate signs of relenting. The cold of a season that had settled into itself completely, and that required of the people living inside it a specific quality of endurance that was different from the endurance required by acute difficulty, was the endurance of the long middle rather than the beginning or the end. The endurance of continuing when the continuing was simply what was required rather than what was dramatic. Nora found she was managing it better than she had managed the previous February. Not because the external conditions were different, because they were not, but because the interior conditions were different in the specific way that interior conditions were different when something in them had shifted, when the ledger that had been running at 0 for a year was showing a different number, and the different number was making a specific difference to the quality of the daily engagement with the daily requirements. She was not happy in any uncomplicated sense. The grief was still present, and the complicated interior accounting of the marriage and its ending was still in process and was likely to be in process for some time yet. But she was, in the specific February mornings, present in a way that she had not been present in the previous February, and the presence was connected to the Wednesday Mercantile conversations and the Sunday exchanges and the specific quality of being known, incrementally and accurately and without agenda, by someone who had been sitting across an aisle from her for a year and who had understood from the specific architecture of her Sunday mornings exactly what the knowing needed to look like in order to be receivable. She had said, in the Wednesday Mercantile in the last week of January, that she was tired of being managed by herself, and the saying of it had been the specific kind of saying that changes the interior relationship between you and the thing you have said. That makes a return to the previous position less available than it had been before the saying. And she had been aware of this at the time and had said it anyway, which was itself the kind of doing that the month of February confirmed had been the right doing. They had talked on the Wednesday after the January declaration with the specific quality of two people who have crossed a threshold and are now on the other side of it, and are still determining what the other side looks like. She had said more to him on that Wednesday than on any previous Wednesday, not because the declaration had opened a floodgate of disclosure, but because the declaration had changed the specific relationship between what she was willing to offer and what she was capable of offering, and what she had previously been keeping behind the careful management had proven, in the first Wednesday after the management was acknowledged, to be things that she was more ready to offer than the management had indicated. She had told him more about the marriage. Not all of it. Not the full complicated interior accounting that she had been doing alone for a year, but enough of it that the shape of it was legible to him, the specific shape of a marriage that had been real and had been insufficient, and that she had been grieving in the complicated way of someone whose grief resisted the simple narrative. He had listened with the complete quality, and when she had finished, he had said the true thing rather than the comfortable thing, which was what he always did. And the true thing had been, you have been very honest with yourself about something that most people find it easier not to be honest about. She had said, I've had a year alone to work through it. He had said, that's not what produces the honesty. He had said, plenty of people have time alone and spend it telling themselves a story that makes the grief simpler. He had said, you've been doing the harder thing. She had said, I didn't choose it. He had said, you chose not to do the easier thing. He had said, that is choosing. She had sat with that for a moment, and then she had said, you're a very specific person, Ford Callahan. He had said, you've said that before. She had said, it keeps being true. The February Sundays had a different quality from the December and January Sundays, not different in their external form, which was still the third pew from the back on opposite sides of the aisle, with the brief exchange on the steps afterward, but different in the specific interior quality of the exchange, which was warmer and more direct and less careful in the specific way that things became less careful when the carefulness had been examined and found to be serving a protective function that was no longer strictly necessary. She said more on the February steps than she had said on any previous steps. He said more too, in the specific sparse way that said more was still not very many words, but that the words had more inside them than they had had before. And the aisle between the two pews had acquired, across the February Sundays, a different quality than it had had for the previous 12 months, which was the quality of something that was being crossed regularly in the small specific ways of two people who had established a genuine acquaintance and were adding to it in the increments available to them. The climax arrived on the second Sunday of February, not through any dramatic external event, but through the specific accumulated weight of everything that had been building since the snowstorm Sunday 2 months before, which had finally reached the point where the weight required a resolution that the incremental additions of Wednesday mercantile conversations and Sunday steps exchanges could not provide. It arrived in the form of a question, asked after the service in the cold February morning. That was the specific question that could only be asked once the foundation of everything preceding it had been sufficiently built. And that once asked could not be unasked. And that Ford Callahan asked with the plain direct quality he brought to everything he offered her. He said, on the church steps in the February cold with the congregation dispersing around them and the specific quality of a Colorado February morning that was bright and cold and entirely honest, would you have supper with me? He said it in the same register. He said everything to her, without the social construction of a formal invitation, without the performance of the asking, simply the plain statement of what he was asking for, offered without embellishment and without the particular pressure of someone who needed the answer to be a specific answer, but who was asking because the asking was the honest thing, and the honest thing was what he did. He said not as a Sunday thing. He said as a thing in itself. She looked at him. The hazel eyes did the specific careful work she had come to understand was their characteristic mode when something important was being assessed. The full comprehensive assessment of the thing in front of her, and what it actually was rather than what it might appear to be. He stood with his hat in his large hands in the February cold, and he let the looking happen without hurrying it or assisting it. Because he understood by now that her process was her process, and that the most respectful thing was to provide it with the space it required. She said, you're asking to have supper with me. He said, yes. She said, at my rooms or somewhere else. He said, wherever you're most comfortable. He said it without the particular quality of someone who had a preference and was concealing it, as the plain statement of someone for whom her comfort was the organizing principle of the answer. She said, that's a very careful way to ask someone to supper. He said, I've had a year to think about how to ask. Something moved in her expression at that. The specific movement of something that had been very still receiving something that was true and that had to be received completely before any response to it was possible. She said, a year. He said, since the second Sunday you came to church. He said, I thought about saying something on the third Sunday and I decided against it. He said, I thought about it on most of the Sundays after that. She said, why didn't you? He said, because you weren't ready. She said, how did you know? He said, I pay attention. He said, I told you it was a habit. She said, you paid attention for a year. He said, you were worth paying attention to. He said it in the same plain register as the simple statement of a thing that was true without the performance of the saying. And she received it the way she had been learning to receive the things he offered, which was completely without the deflection or the minimization that had been her previous mode of receiving things that were true and that cost her something to receive. She said, I didn't know you were paying attention. He said, I know. He said, you weren't supposed to know yet. She said, was there a schedule? He said, not a schedule. He said, more of a sense of what the timing required. She said, and now you think the timing requires supper. He said, I think the timing has been requiring supper for a while. He said, I think I've been waiting for you to arrive at the same conclusion. She said, what makes you think I've arrived at it? He said, the fact that you're still standing here asking me questions about the timing rather than saying no and walking away. She looked at him. She said, that's a very specific piece of reasoning. He said, I pay attention to specific things. She said, you keep saying that. He said, it keeps being relevant. She said, Ford? He said, yes. She said, I've been afraid, he said. I know, she said, for longer than the year. He said, I figured. She said, I'm not sure I know how to do this. He said, which part? She said, any of it. She said, the being present in something, the letting it be what it is rather than managing it into something safe. He said, you've been doing it in the mercantile every Wednesday for 2 months. She said, that felt different. He said, why? She said, because I didn't know what it was yet. He said, and now you do. She said, I think I do. He said, what is it? She was quiet for a moment. She said, it's the thing that I stopped letting myself want after January of last year. He said, tell me what that is. She said, something that I'm in because I chose to be in it. He said, yes. He said it quietly and with the complete quality of someone receiving something they have been patient for and that has arrived exactly as it was supposed to arrive. He said, that's what I'm asking you to supper for. She said, I know. She said, that's why I'm going to say yes. He was very still for a moment, then he said, good. He said it with the specific quality that was his version of the fullest expression available to him, which was the specific plain quality of someone for whom the word was containing everything that a longer response would have contained and was more honest for the containment. She said, Saturday. He said, Saturday. She said, I'll cook. He said, you don't have to. She said, I want to. She said, I'm a good cook. He said, I don't doubt it. She said, you'll be there at 6. He said, I'll be there at 6. She said, don't bring anything. He said, I'll bring something. She said, Ford. He said, I'll bring something modest. She looked at him and the something that had been happening at the corners of her mouth across the February Sundays arrived more completely than it had yet arrived, was a genuine smile rather than the approximation of one, and he received it with the gray eyes and the specific expression that was his fullest expression, which was the expression of someone receiving something they have been patient for and finding it exactly what they had believed it would be. The Saturday supper was simple and genuine and had the specific quality that things had when they had been arrived at through the specific channel of two honest people discovering each other incrementally and carefully and with the full weight of their actual selves rather than the performed versions. She cooked well, as she had said, and he brought bread from the bakery on Main Street, which was the modest something he had promised. And they sat at her kitchen table with the February dark outside and the lamp between them and talked in the way they had been learning to talk, which was honestly and directly, and with the specific quality of two people who had run out of reasons to be careful with each other in the ways that had been preventing them from being fully present. He told her about the years before Harlan Falls with a fullness that the mercantile conversations had not yet provided, about the Texas operation and his father's death and the specific grief of that loss and what had come after it, the specific disorientation of someone for whom the organizing principle of a life has been removed and who is in the process of determining what comes next. She listened with the complete quality and asked the questions that told him she had understood not just the content, but the interior of what he was describing. And he answered those questions with the full honesty he brought to everything he offered her. She told him about Robert, more of it than she had told him on any previous occasion, told him the actual shape of the marriage rather than the adjacent truths, told him about the specific quality of the difficulty of the later years and about the specific complicated quality of the grief that had followed, the grief for what was real and the grief for what had not been, and the specific guilt about the relief and the specific guilt about the guilt. He listened with the complete quality that was his specific gift, the listening that did not require her to shape the telling into something more comfortable but that received it in whatever shape it came. And when she finished, he said the true thing, which was, you have nothing to be ashamed of in any of that. She said, I know that in my mind. He said, what about the rest? She said, the rest is working on it. He said, that's the only way it works. She said, is that the voice of experience? He said, I've had things I was ashamed of that I had no reason to be ashamed of. He said, it takes longer than it should, working through to the other side of it. She said, what helped? He said, time. He said, and being honest about it with someone who received the honesty without using it against me. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. She said, is that what you've been doing? He said, trying to. She said, you've been succeeding. He said, I'm glad. He said it with a specific warmth that was in his eyes rather than his voice. The warmth that she had been learning to see across the Sunday mornings and the Wednesday mercantile visits, and that was, at the distance of a kitchen table rather than a church aisle or a mercantile floor, entirely clear. She said, toward the end of the evening, with the direct quality she had been learning from him and that had become, across the months, a register she was beginning to use more naturally. I was very alone before the storm, he said. I know, she said, I didn't think it was going to change. He said, I know that too. She said, what made you knock on the pew rather than just moving to the end of it? He said, I didn't knock on the pew. She said, you moved to the end of it and said nothing and let me sit. He said, that wasn't knocking on a pew. She said it was the equivalent. He thought about this honestly. He said, I wanted you to know that the space was available without making the availability into something you had to respond to. He said, moving to the end of the pew was the answer to a practical problem. He said, saying my name afterward was something else. She said, what was it? He said, it was me deciding that 11 months was enough time to have maintained the distance without being certain the distance was serving either of us. She said, was it? He said, I don't know. He said, I know it served you for a long time. He said, I'm less certain about the last few months of it. She said, why? He said, because you were ready before the storm. She said, how do you know? He said, because you stayed on the steps afterward. She said, I stayed because of the snow. He said, you stayed because part of you wanted to. She looked at him. She said, you are very specific. He said, you keep telling me that. She said, it keeps being the accurate thing to say. He said, I'll take that. He left at 9 o'clock with the specific unhurried quality of his departures, which were always the departures of someone who had been present for the full duration of the occasion and who was leaving because the occasion had run its natural course rather than because he had somewhere else to be. At the door, he put on his coat and his hat with the same deliberate care, and he looked at her in the lamplight from the doorway and said, next Sunday. She said, I'll be there. He said, I know. He said, I'll see you Wednesday first. She said, yes. He said, good night, Nora Vale. She said, good night, Ford Callahan. He went down the stairs and she stood at the door for a moment listening to his boots on the steps and then the specific quiet of his absence, which was a different quality of quiet from the quiet of the previous year, was the quiet of someone who had been there and had left rather than the quiet of someone who had never been there at all. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a moment with her hand on the door and she felt the specific quality of something she had been working toward without knowing she was working toward it, which was the quality of being in a moment she was actually in. Present in it in the specific way of someone who has stopped managing the moment and started inhabiting it. She was afraid. She was also something that was not the opposite of afraid, but that existed alongside it. The specific quality of someone who has examined the fear and found it to be the kind of fear that was the evidence of something real rather than the warning against something dangerous. The fear that was the cost of caring rather than the cost of risk. The fear of someone who had let something matter and was now in the specific position of having something that mattered. She had been in that position before. She had been in it, and she had been hurt by it, and she had learned from the hurt, and she had constructed from the learning the specific management system that had been protecting her from this position for a year, and that she had acknowledged in the January mercantile she was tired of maintaining. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the door, and she chose, with the full weight of the choosing, to be in the position. Not because the fear was gone, not because the risk was absent, but because Ford Callahan had been sitting across an aisle from her for a year with the specific patient quality of someone for whom the waiting was a form of respect rather than a form of strategy, and because he had said her name in a half-empty church on a snowstorm Sunday in December and had asked nothing from the saying except the acknowledgement that they had finally been introduced, and because the specific quality of what had been building since that Sunday was the specific quality of something real, and real was what she had been working her way back toward. She had been afraid of real for a year. She was still afraid of it. She was in it anyway, which was like coming back to herself. One specific Saturday supper at a time. March arrived in Harlan Falls with the first suggestion that the winter was not permanent, which was not spring and was not intended to be mistaken for spring, but was the specific quality of a March morning in the Colorado mountains when the light arrived at a slightly different angle than it had in February, and the specific hard-packed quality of the snow on the main street had begun. In the south-facing sections where the sun reached it directly in the early afternoon, to show the first faint suggestion of the thaw that was still weeks away, but that was no longer entirely theoretical. It was a change that required attention to notice, the kind of change that was visible only to someone who had been looking at the same landscape long enough to register the difference between what it had been and what it was now. And Nora noticed it on the first clear morning of March from the window of her rooms on Callaway Street, and felt the specific quality of noticing it that was different from the quality of noticing things that she had been doing for a year, which was the quality of someone who was present in the noticing rather than managing it from behind the specific careful distance she had been maintaining between herself and the world she was moving through. She had been present in more things since February. Not dramatically, not with the particular announced quality of a transformation that declared itself to the available audience, but in the specific incremental way of things that changed because the conditions that had prevented the change had themselves changed. The way a room became lighter when a window that had been covered was uncovered, not through any addition of light, but through the removal of the thing that had been preventing the existing light from coming through. The window in her case was not a literal window, though the March light through her actual window was part of what she was noticing, but the specific interior window that Ford Callahan had been sitting patiently on the other side of for a year while she worked out, in the specific way that she worked out things that required the full duration of the working out, whether she was ready to uncover it. She had uncovered it. The covering had been her own management system. The specific architecture of self-protection she had built across the year after Robert's death. And the uncovering had not been a single dramatic act, but the accumulation of many small deliberate ones. Beginning with the snowstorm Sunday when she had sat in a pew she had not chosen and ending, for the moment, with the February Saturday supper, when she had told him the full complicated shape of the marriage and he had received it with the complete quality and had said the true thing, which was that she had nothing to be ashamed of in any of it. The Saturday suppers had continued into March. Not every Saturday, because his ranch work was not always compatible with a 12-mile ride into town on a Saturday evening, and because she understood the shape of a working ranch's calendar well enough by now to know which Saturdays were and were not available. But most Saturdays, and on the Saturdays that were not available, they had established the specific pattern of two people who had found a reliable rhythm and who maintained it with the consistency of something that had been chosen rather than something that had simply accumulated. The Wednesday mercantile visits continued. The Sunday exchanges continued, growing longer on the steps than they had been in January and February, the congregation occasionally observing the length of them with the specific communal attention of a small town that had moved from generating opinions about the situation to simply having absorbed it as a fact of the social landscape. Mrs. Carver had approached her again in early March, with the specific warm purposefulness of the previous approach but with a different content, which was that she wanted Nora to know that the Women's Society would be pleased to have her involvement, if she was ever so inclined, offered in the tone of someone who had revised a previous position and was extending an invitation rather than a caution. Nora had received it with the composed grace that was her characteristic mode in social encounters she had not arranged, and had thanked Mrs. Carver genuinely and had said she would think about it, which was the truth rather than the social deflection that the same words had often been in the previous year. She thought about it. Across the March evenings, in the specific quiet of the rooms on Callaway Street that had a different quality than the previous year's evenings, she thought about what Mrs. Carver's invitation meant and what her response to it said about where she was in the specific process of returning to herself that the winter had been. She understood that the returning was not complete and was not going to be complete for some time, and that complete was perhaps not the right framework for thinking about it. That the self she was returning to was not the self she had been before Robert, and before the marriage and before the year of grief, because she was not those years younger, and she had not been through those things, and the going through of them had produced someone who was different from who she had been before, not lesser but different, with a different relationship to her own interior and a different understanding of what she needed and what she was capable of and what the world could offer when it was allowed to offer it. She thought about what Fort Callahan had offered, which was not a rescue and was not a restoration, and was not the particular return to a previous state that grief sometimes convinced people it was possible to arrange. What he had offered was something more specific and more honest than any of those things, which was simply the consistent patient presence of someone who had been paying attention from the right distance for the right amount of time, and who had understood, from the paying of the attention, what form the offering needed to take in order to be receivable. He had offered the space before he had offered the presence, and the space had been the specific thing she had needed before the presence could be anything other than pressure, and the understanding of that specific sequencing told her something about him that was more reliable than anything that could have been demonstrated in a shorter time or through a less patient method. She had told him on the third Saturday supper in March that she was thinking about saying yes to Mrs. Carver's invitation. He had said, "That's good." She had said, "You think so?" He had said, "I think you've been in Harlan Falls for 14 months and you still don't quite live here." He had said, saying yes to Mrs. Carver's invitation would be a step toward living here. She had said, as opposed to, he had said, passing through. She had said, "I've been here 14 months. He had said, people pass through places for years. He had said, living in a place is different from being in a place. She had said, you keep coming back to this distinction. He had said, because it keeps being the relevant one. She had looked at him across her kitchen table in the March lamplight, and she had said, "I'm working on it." He had said, "I know." He had said, "That's why I'm here." The simplicity of that sentence had stayed with her through the week. The specific plain quality of it, that was his characteristic quality. The absence of anything decorative or qualifying. Just the plain statement of why he was there, which was because she was working on something and he was here. Not because she had arrived, not because the work was done, because it was in process and he was present in the process. She had thought about the year of Sundays and about the specific quality of someone who had been on the other side of an aisle for that year without speaking, not from indifference, but from the specific understanding that her process was her process and that the right thing was to be present without being pressure, and she had understood in the March week that this was not something that had stopped being true because they were now on the same side of a kitchen table on Saturday evenings. He was still present without being pressure. He was still giving her process the space it required. He was doing this not as a strategy, but as simply how he was. And the simple how he was of it was the specific thing that was making the difference to whether the process was producing what it was capable of producing. She said yes to Mrs. Carver's invitation in the second week of March. She attended the first Women's Society meeting with the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the managing of the decision can intercept the execution. And she sat in the circle of women in the church hall on a Thursday afternoon, and she was present in the way she had been learning to be present, which was with the full weight of herself rather than the managed version. And the meeting was ordinary and warm and entirely unremarkable, and she was glad to have gone. She told Ford on the following Wednesday. He said, "How was it?" She said, "Ordinary." He said, "Good ordinary or difficult ordinary?" She said, "Both." She said, "Mostly good." He said, "Will you go again?" She said, "I think so." He said, "Good." She said, "You say that a lot." He said, "Only when I mean it." She said, "Do you always mean it?" He said, "I try to only say things I mean." She said, "What do you mean when you say good in response to something I tell you I'm going to do?" He thought about this honestly, in the specific way he thought about things she asked him that required the honest answer. He said, "I mean that I'm glad you're doing the thing, and I'm glad you told me you're doing it, and I'm glad that you're becoming more present in a place that you live in." He said, "All of that at once." She said, "That's a lot of meaning for one word." He said, "I'm economical." She said, "I've noticed." He said, "Is that a criticism?" She said, "It's an observation." He said, "Of what?" She said, "Of someone who means everything he says and says everything he means, and who has been doing that consistently enough that I've stopped expecting something else underneath the saying." He said, "What were you expecting?" She said, "Something that required managing." He said, "And..." She said, "And there isn't anything that requires managing." He said, "How does that feel?" She said, "Strange." She said, "Good, strange." He said, "Good." She looked at him. She said, "There it is again." He said, "I meant all of it again." She said, "I know." She said, "That's why I told you." The Sunday of the third week of March was the first Sunday since the previous December that Nora Vale was still on the church steps, when most of the congregation had gone. Talking to Ford Callahan in the specific quality of a March morning that was beginning, in the warmth of the direct sunlight, to feel like the first rehearsal of the spring that was coming, Reverend Marsh passed them on his way down the steps and said, with the particular dry warmth of a man who had been presiding over the full range of human experience for 40 years and who was not easily surprised by any of it, "Good morning, you two." They said good morning back in unison without having planned the unison, and the unison produced in both of them the specific expression of two people who have found something genuine and are surprised by the finding of it, which was not the grand expression of a dramatic moment, but the small, honest expression of something that was simply there, and that was, in the specific quality of a March morning in Harlan Falls, Colorado, enough. He asked her to marry him on the last Sunday of March, not on the church steps, because the church steps were a public space and what he had to say required a private one, but on the walk home afterward, on the 2-block stretch of Callaway Street that had become, across the months since the snowstorm Sunday, the specific in-between space where the things that needed to be said between the public occasion of the Sunday service and the private space of the kitchen got said. He said it in the same register. He said everything without construction, without the particular staging of the moment, as the plain statement of what he was asking for and why. He said, "I know this is fast." She said, "It's been 16 months. He said, "Of which we've been talking for 4. She said, "That's a specific way to account for the time." He said, "I'm specific." She said, "I know." She said, "Ask me the thing." He said, "Will you marry me?" He said, "I know you're still working on things, and I know the working isn't done, and I'm not asking because it's done." He said, "I'm asking because I want to be here while it continues, and I would rather be here in the specific way that's permanent than in the specific way that's provisional." She looked at him on the March street in the specific quality of a late March morning that was genuinely beginning to feel like the beginning of something rather than just the end of something else. And she felt the specific quality of the moment, which was the quality of something she had not expected to arrive and that had arrived anyway through the specific channel of a bad snowstorm in a church pew in a year of Sundays and a large quiet man who had understood from the specific architecture of her carefully constructed invisibility exactly what the seeing of her needed to look like in order to be something she could receive. She said, "I'm still afraid." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to be afraid for a while yet." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And you're asking anyway." He said, "I'm asking because of it, not in spite of it." He said, "The fact that you're still afraid and you're still here is the specific thing that tells me this is real." She said, "That's a very specific piece of reasoning." He said, "I pay attention to specific things." She said, "Ford." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Good." She said, "That's all you have." He said, "It contains everything." She said, "I know it does." She said, "That's why it's the right answer." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had taken her hand, and his hand was large and warm and entirely itself. The hand of a man who had been sitting across a church aisle from her for a year, and who had understood, from the quality of the sitting, what form the patience needed to take. And she felt the warmth of it in the specific way you felt the warmth of something that had been outside your reach and was now present. And she held it with the specific quality of someone who has decided to hold something and is not going to let the holding be the thing they manage away. There is a lesson in Nora Vale's story that belongs to everyone who has ever built a careful architecture around themselves to protect them from the specific vulnerability of being seen. Everyone who has ever sat in the third pew from the back near the door so they could leave before anyone could speak to them. Everyone who has ever arrived late and left early to avoid the specific cost of being in a room with people who might look at them directly. Everyone who has ever made themselves invisible so thoroughly and so consistently that the invisibility became the thing the community accepted as their nature rather than a response to circumstances the community didn't know about. The lesson is not that the architecture was wrong. The architecture was right for what it was needed for and for as long as it was needed. Nora Vale had survived a complicated grief inside that architecture and had done the specific interior work of a year alone that needed to be done alone, and the architecture had made the doing of it possible. The lesson is not that she should have let the walls down sooner, or that the year of invisibility was a year wasted. The lesson is that the architecture was always temporary, and that the right thing, when the time came, was to acknowledge that it had served its purpose and to let the next thing begin. The next thing required courage of the specific kind, that is not the courage of someone who is no longer afraid, but the courage of someone who is still afraid and who has decided that the fear is the evidence of something real and that something real is what they have been working toward. It required the specific willingness to be seen by someone who had been sitting across an aisle for a year and who had understood, from the watching, what the seeing needed to look like, and who had been patient enough and honest enough and specific enough to provide exactly that. Callahan had been sitting across the aisle for a year because he had understood that this was what the year required. Not because he was not afraid of his own loneliness. Not because the year had been easy, but because he had paid the right kind of attention for long enough to know that what Nora Vale needed was not someone walking across the aisle toward her before she was ready for the crossing, but someone being reliably present on the other side of it until the crossing became something she chose rather than something that was done to her. He had provided that. He had provided it with the specific patience of someone for whom the provision was not a sacrifice but a form of respect. And the respect had been the thing that had made the difference between the architecture coming down and the architecture remaining in place indefinitely. Some people were never meant to be invisible. Not because they couldn't sustain the invisibility, because Nora Vale had sustained it for 14 months with considerable skill, but because the full dimensions of who they were required a witness. And the witness required someone who understood that the witnessing had to be earned through the specific quality of presence that was patient without being passive and attentive, without being intrusive and honest, without being demanding. Callahan had been that witness. From the second Sunday she came to church to the last Sunday of March, when she said yes on a Colorado street in the first genuine warmth of the approaching spring. She had been seen from the other side of a church aisle for a year before she had known she was being seen. The being seen without her knowledge had not been a violation but a form of care. The specific form of care that maintained the distance she needed while establishing the foundation that the closing of the distance would eventually require. He had been building the foundation for a year. She had been building herself back in the specific interior way that the rebuilding of a self required at the same time. And the two buildings had arrived in the specific compressed social circumstance of a snowstorm and one available pew and the plain exchange of two names in a half-empty church. At the moment when they could be combined into something that was neither of them alone, but was the specific thing that two honest people who had each been alone for the right amount of time could build when they were finally in the same pew. You were never meant to be invisible. The careful architecture you have built around yourself has served its purpose, and you have survived inside it, the things that needed to be survived. But surviving was not the whole of what you were put here to do. Somewhere on the other side of the aisle from where you're sitting, there is a person who has been paying the right kind of attention for the right amount of time and who has understood from the paying of it what form the approaching needs to take in order to be something you can receive. They are not going to walk across the aisle before you are ready. They are going to be there when you are. And when the snowstorm comes and the only available pew is on their side of the aisle, you will sit down next to them and the service will begin. And the distance that has been the width of an aisle for however long it has been will become the width of a pew, and everything that follows from that will be the story that was always supposed to be yours. You only needed to stay in the pew long enough to hear your own name. And someone on the other side of the aisle was always going to say it. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. You only need to let it.